Atlanta, Georgia. Would you help someone who never once looked at you with kindness? 7-year-old Malik Carter had never known luxury, only struggle. His home was a rundown shack with a leaky roof and barely any electricity. His mother worked tirelessly, juggling multiple jobs just to put food on the table. Despite her sacrifices, there were still nights Malik went to bed hungry. Most afternoons, Malik wandered the city park, watching other kids play while he searched for spare change or a free meal. He had learned to survive in a world that barely noticed him. No one spared him a second glance, especially not people like Eleanor Whitmore. Eleanor was the kind of woman who had everything: money, power, and influence, but no patience for those she deemed beneath her. The elderly billionaire had spent decades growing her empire, accumulating wealth beyond imagination, but she had also built walls around her heart, shutting out kindness and compassion. To her, people like Malik were nuisances, reminders of a world she had long ignored. That sweltering afternoon, the air was thick with heat, the pavement radiating waves of suffocating warmth. Malik wiped the sweat from his forehead, his empty stomach growling as he searched for a shady spot to rest. That was when he heard the soft thud. Across the park, Eleanor Whitmore collapsed onto the ground, her frail body motionless. Pedestrians walked past, some glancing at her briefly before continuing on their way. No one stopped. No one helped. Perhaps they assumed she was just another elderly woman enjoying the sun, or maybe they simply didn't care. But Malik did. He hesitated at first. He knew who she was. Everyone in the city did. She was the type of person who never would have glanced his way, who would have clutched her purse tighter if he had walked too close. And yet, despite everything, she was just a person in need. And Malik had been raised to do the right thing. If you were Malik, would you have stopped to help? Where are you watching from, and what time is it? The sun blazed as Eleanor took a slow walk through the park, refusing to accept her age or her limits. Sweat dripped down her face. Her vision blurred. Her legs wobbled. The heat was relentless, pressing against her like an invisible weight. She had felt dizzy earlier but ignored it, unwilling to admit weakness. Suddenly, thud! Eleanor collapsed onto the sidewalk, gasping for air. Her body crumpled like a puppet whose strings had been cut. Pedestrians glanced her way but kept walking, assuming someone else would help. Some looked concerned but hesitated. Others simply continued with their day, indifferent to the woman struggling for breath on the ground. But Malik didn't hesitate. He ran straight to her. "Miss, are you okay?" he asked, his small hands shaking her shoulder. His heart pounded in his chest. She barely opened her eyes, her lips dry and cracked. He could see the exhaustion in her face, the struggle in her shallow breathing. Remembering what his mother had taught him, Malik sprang into action. His mind raced through the lessons she had drilled into him. First, shade. He glanced around, spotting a tree nearby. He grabbed Eleanor's arms and, with all the strength his tiny frame could muster, dragged her toward the cooler patch of grass beneath its branches. His muscles burned, but he didn't stop. He fanned her with his hands, the sweat on his brow dripping onto the hot pavement. His stomach growled, reminding him of his own hunger, but he ignored it. A person needed his help. That was more important. Then, water. He ran to the nearest fountain, cupped his hands, and hurried back. Droplets splashed onto the ground as he kneeled beside her. "Drink this," he said, tilting the water to her lips. At first, she barely reacted, but after a few drops touched her tongue, her cracked lips parted slightly. He poured a little more, watching relief spread across her face as she swallowed. Her breath steadied, her eyes finally focusing. She blinked several times before she really saw him. Her usual sharp expression was softened by confusion. What would you have done in Malik's place? Paramedics arrived, checking Eleanor's vitals. The scene was chaotic, yet Malik stood still, watching as the professionals worked around him. The tension in the air was thick, but the only thing on his mind was whether Eleanor would be okay. "Who helped her?" one of the paramedics asked, glancing around at the small crowd that had gathered. Malik wiped the sweat from his forehead. "I did." Eleanor, still weak, turned her head slightly to look at him. Her expression was unreadable, somewhere between shock and something else, something unspoken. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but quickly closed it again. Her pride wouldn't let her speak the words she knew she should say. "He saved you, ma'am," the paramedic said, shaking his head in admiration. "If he hadn't stepped in, this could have been a lot worse." Eleanor's fingers trembled slightly, and she let out a small breath. But the words she needed to say got caught in her throat. She merely turned her face away, staring at the sky instead. Malik frowned but shrugged, a hint of disappointment flickering across his face. "It's okay," he muttered under his breath. "I was just doing what was right." Without another word, he turned to leave, not expecting anything in return. He didn't help her for a reward or recognition. He just knew it was the right thing to do. His mother had always taught him that kindness wasn't about who deserved it. It was about who needed it. Eleanor watched as he walked away, the weight of what had happened settling into her chest. She had spent her whole life believing people like Malik were beneath her, unworthy of her time or consideration. And yet, when she was at her most vulnerable, it wasn't her wealth, her connections, or even the dozens of strangers passing by that had saved her. It was him, the boy she had ignored countless times, the child she had assumed was nothing more than a shadow in the background of her perfect world. Something inside her shifted in that moment. Later that evening, as she sat in her grand home, sipping tea to steady her nerves, she couldn't stop thinking about him, about his small, calloused hands shaking her awake, about the sweat on his brow as he ran to bring her water, about the quiet way he walked away, expecting nothing, demanding nothing. For the first time in her life, Eleanor Whitmore wondered if she had been wrong. Sometimes it takes an act of kindness to break a lifetime of prejudice. Do you think Eleanor would have helped Malik if the roles were reversed? Days later, Eleanor couldn't stop thinking about Malik. Every moment played in her mind, the way he had rushed to her side, the determination in his small hands as he helped her, the way he expected nothing in return. That boy saved my life, and I never even thanked him. The thought unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. For years, Eleanor had looked at the world in a certain way. People like Malik were background noise, invisible to her life of wealth and privilege. But now she had a debt she couldn't ignore. Determined to make things right, Eleanor sent her assistant to find him. When she received the address, she insisted on going herself. As she stepped out of her luxury car and onto the cracked pavement, she was stunned by what she saw. A crumbling house stood before her, its roof sagging, windows patched with cardboard. The yard was barren, save for a rusted bicycle lying on its side. Eleanor clutched her purse tightly as she walked to the door. She had spent her life avoiding places like this. Now she was walking straight into one. The door opened and there stood Malik, his face filled with confusion. "Miss, why are you here?" Eleanor swallowed hard. To fix what I got wrong. Malik's mother appeared behind him, her eyes weary, her hands wiping flour from her apron. Can I help you? Eleanor took a deep breath. Yes. She pulled out a set of documents, her hands shaking slightly. I want to sponsor Malik's education, his future. And, she hesitated, searching for the right words, I want to make him my heir. The room fell silent. Malik's mother blinked, gripping the doorframe as if needing support. Wait, what? Malik's eyes widened. Like family? Eleanor nodded. Like family. Malik's mother looked at her son, then back at Eleanor. Why? Eleanor hesitated, then said the only truth she had. Because he deserves more than this, and because I owe him more than just gratitude. Malik looked between his mother and Eleanor, his young mind trying to process what this meant. A life he had never dared to imagine was suddenly being offered to him. A future free from struggle, filled with opportunities he never thought possible. Tears welled in his mother's eyes. This is a lot to take in. I know, Eleanor said softly. Take your time. Malik turned to his mother. What do you think? She knelt down, brushing his cheek. Baby, it's your choice. Malik looked back at Eleanor. The woman who had once ignored him now stood before him, offering him everything. The boy who had nothing now had everything. If you were Malik, would you have accepted her offer? Eleanor legally made Malik the beneficiary of her wealth. The paperwork was signed, the trust fund established, and a new chapter began. It was the kind of future Malik's mother had dreamed of for her son, but never thought possible. You saved my life, Eleanor told him one afternoon as they sat on the porch of his new home. Now, let me help change yours. Malik's mother wiped away tears as she looked around their new house. It was warm, filled with furniture, stocked with food, things they had once struggled to afford. We don't even know how to thank you, she whispered. Eleanor shook her head. No thanks necessary. Just promise me you'll never stop believing in yourself. Malik nodded, gripping the edges of the scholarship letter he had just received. He was officially enrolled in one of the best private schools in the city. The same school that once would have ignored a boy like him. The transition wasn't easy. He wasn't used to luxury, to having choices, to being treated like he mattered. But Eleanor was there, guiding him through it, making sure he never felt alone. Over time, something else changed, Eleanor herself. She started spending more time with Malik's family, attending community events she once avoided, and listening to the stories of those she had ignored for so long. I thought I was giving you something, she admitted one day. But really, you saved me. Years passed, and Malik grew into a young man with ambition and purpose. He no longer saw himself as the boy who had nothing. He was now someone who could make a difference. As Eleanor's health declined, he never left her side. When she passed, it was Malik who ensured her legacy wasn't just one of wealth, but of change. He used her fortune to invest in struggling communities, fund education programs, and create opportunities for kids like him. He stood before a crowd at a charity event, speaking with confidence. Eleanor Whitmore taught me that kindness is more powerful than money, that change isn't about what you have, but what you do with it. The audience applauded, but Malik only smiled. He knew the real victory wasn't the applause. It was the lives he was about to change. Because sometimes the greatest riches aren't money, but the people who change our hearts. Do you believe people like Eleanor can truly change? Years later, Malik became a doctor, dedicating his life to helping those in need just as he once helped Eleanor. He worked in underserved communities, providing care to families who couldn't afford medical treatment. His journey from a struggling child to a respected physician became an inspiration for many. One day, after treating a patient, a reporter approached him. "What's next for you?" she asked, holding out a microphone. Malik smiled warmly, his eyes filled with purpose. "Giving back, because someone once gave me a second chance, and I want to do the same for others." Eleanor had passed away peacefully, but not before ensuring her legacy would live on through Malik. Her wealth, once used only for luxury, was now funding scholarships, building clinics, and supporting young people who faced the same struggles Malik had once endured. On the day of her memorial, Malik stood before a crowd, looking at the large portrait of Eleanor displayed on the stage. "She was the grandmother I never knew I needed," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "She thought she was saving me, but in the end, we saved each other." As he stepped down, he noticed children from the scholarship program in the front row, their hopeful faces a reminder of the cycle of kindness that had been set in motion. Malik walked over, kneeling to their level. "You can be anything you want to be," he told them. "Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." The program continued to grow, and so did Malik's impact. Hospitals named wings after him, schools taught his story, and young students dreamed of following in his footsteps. But to him, the real victory wasn't the recognition. It was knowing that no child in his community would ever feel as hopeless as he once had. One afternoon, as he walked through the neighborhood where he had grown up, he saw a young boy sitting on a bench, looking lost. Malik sat beside him. "You okay?" he asked gently. The boy hesitated, then nodded. "I just don't know what to do with my life," Malik smiled. "I used to feel the same way. But then I learned something important. Kindness can change everything. And you have the power to change the world." The boy's eyes lit up with hope, just as Malik's had all those years ago. Malik had won his battle that day, but in the end, he had rewritten the future for generations to come. What lessons can we learn from Malik's story? How can we apply them to our own lives? Would you have done what Malik did? Comment below, like, and share if you believe in the power of kindness.